so far the nicest venue I've been in a crypto conference. And today I'm actually going to talk about when Cow protocol, which is actually the protocol that I work with, meet RWAs, and how actually the protocol unlocks, what we all kind of thought would be the true DeFi vision. First of all, some disclaimers. Please do not take this as my legal advice. And also, this is not financial advice. I'm not a regulator. I'm not an entity that has the capabilities to give financial advice. And anything that I say on this talk is mainly informational and kind of my own opinion. So don't take everything that I say in regards of the RWAs and its schemes as the only source of truth. And as always in crypto, do your own research so you can form your own actual opinion. All right, so TradFi is on-chain. Finally, this is happening, right? Like, this is no longer kind of like a dream or kind of something that we talk in the news that the institutions are coming. It's finally happened. The institutions are here. Maybe not to buy our bags, but at least they're building something on chain, which is quite fun and quite amazing to see, right? And if we look at RWAs, kind of the first elephant in the room, let's say, or the first RWA that gets mostly overlooked is, of course, stablecoins, right? Stablecoins is the one token or the one WA to have reached, I would say, certainly mass adoption. There's currently around 300 billion of market cap across all different stablecoins. Primarily, they're derived from the US dollar, but this is huge because if you think about it, 300 billion is the GDP of Finland or Chile, which is quite amazing to see, for just simple magic internet money. Then the beautiful thing about stablecoins is that, like on their counterpart, the fiat, right? The stablecoins run 24/7 on chain. They actually have no borders. They're fully like cross-border, and the simplicity in which they can operate or reach the masses is extremely high compared to the fiat counterparts, right? And this is quite beneficial for a lot of people because, for example, if we think cross-border payments, right, or remittances, if you live in poorer countries of the world and you work in like a more kind of developed country and you send money home, right now you have the Western Union and the similars charging a huge kind of intermediary fee to send money abroad. On the other hand, right, stable coins don't charge any fee. Well, I guess one can argue that you have to pay gas fees, but the fees that they're charged just for simply sending money from address to address is significantly lower in comparison. Not only do they have that benefit, but also, for example, if you're not a US resident, but you do want to hold US dollars because for whatever reason you don't want to hold the currency that you're in your country, it's actually way easier to hold them, right? If I were to open right now a bank account in the country that I'm from, in Spain, and I want exposure to the US dollar, I need to open a new bank account, set up a new contract, etc., and there's a lot of fees associated. Whereas with the stablecoins, I guess if I had crypto, I can just simply swap them and get the stablecoin. But if I don't, I just need to send the euros to a centralized exchange, basically swap for stablecoins, and then withdraw them to my address, and that's it, right? Something that is fairly simple and takes, I don't know, couple of hours in comparison to the fiat counterpart that would take at least 1 or 2 days for opening the bank account if I'm fast and reviewing the contract and kind of like all the things they have to sign up. But most importantly is the fact that they operate 24/7. Because one example that actually like I felt kind of annoyed last week was May 1st was holiday in Spain. And on the 1st of May, I have to pay my landlord every day. So on April 30th, well, May 1st, no, on the 1st of the month. So on April 30th, I went to do the bank transfer to pay my rent for my landlord. And because May 1st was a holiday, my landlord did not receive the money until May 5th, which was Monday. So it took 4 days to actually send the money in the same country, in Spain, being like with having SEPA transfer and all that, but not all banks are on board. So this is kind of, I would argue, outrageous that in the 21st century it takes 4 days in the same country to send the money peer-to-peer in the same currency and everything. So this is something that truly like stablecoins can really unlock. But stablecoins are not the only asset that are growing, right? If we kind of take aside the stablecoin RWA market, we can also look at other RWAs that are booming. And in total, we have around $30 billion in value. And if we see kind of like the exponential growth, or I guess the graph makes it look a little bit linearish, but kind of the explosion in these type of assets came after the US 2024 election, when it was kind of, because the party that won, it was known that they wanted to kind of kill the current like predatory SEC and put in place a more crypto-friendly SEC, that then people started jumping on board on chain, right? And as you can see, the RWA market is made up of a bunch of different categories. Of course, it's still predominantly like dominant by US kind of financial products, but this is just the beginnings, because if we think about it, the US is the biggest capital markets in the world, so it makes sense that they are the kind of first one to jump on board, or the ones that people want the most access to. And if we look at the breakdown, right, we have the biggest category is basically tokenized US Treasury. This is basically T-bills and government debt that people want exposure to. And here, the total amount is $15 billion. Unfortunately, for here our European brothers, the European kind of debt or the European treasury bills are not that big in comparison. They're like 1.2 billion. We also have the second biggest category, which is commodities, which is 5.1 billion. Basically, these are like synthetic assets or kind of representations of the actual physical commodities, like gold. I think gold here is the predominant kind of RWA that leads this sector. But one has to be careful with this, because, for example, recently there was this kind of exposure on Twitter from this reviewer that saw the precious metal USD, which was a stable coin technically backed by US dollar. A USD stablecoin that was backed by precious metals by a company in Canada, that it turned out to be like a little bit like a 50-50, because when they realized and they did the audit, it seems that it wasn't really the actual commodity that was backing, but it was actually like an IOU, basically like a certificate that the mining company would actually extract these metals and will kind of back up the value of this USD called precious metals USD. And once was this exposed, basically the so-called stablecoin kind of crashed, and when lost 90% of its value, regained a little bit after the company said something, and now it's sitting only like at a 50% DPEG. So even though RWAs are cool and kind of it's awesome to see things going on chain, you still have to do like a lot of due diligence when you interact. Then you have asset-backed credit, which is basically tokenized credit assets like non-sovereign debt. And in here, the biggest kind of project that is leading this category is actually a native crypto project called Maple Finance. And I think out of the 2.5 billion, half of it or more than half of it, I think it was 1.5 billion, is actually the exposure of Syrup USDC, which is a USD stablecoin with yield that it offers, I think it was 4% something. And basically what it does is you have a claim against the yield that Maple Finance is actually earning from you depositing those dollars with them. Then you also have active strategies, which is basically like fund of funds, hedge funds, private equity. And even though this category is relatively big, right? It's like 1.2 billion. I would argue that this one is less for retail and kind of more for institutions, like money for institutions, instead of kind of like the wider mass, because you still have harsh like KYC requirements. You need to be like an accredited investor to have exposure to these assets and so on. And lastly, we also have tokenized stocks, or tokenized equity, tokenized securities, whatever you want to call them. And here is the most interesting category, because it's the one that actually has seen in the shorter term the highest growth, not only in terms of USD volume, but also in terms of users kind of address holding these type of tokens. And this is basically just the representation of stocks, ETFs, or equities that are minted natively on chain, although we've also have variations of synthetic derivatives. But what do we mean, right, when we say RWAs? And that's kind of like the key point. Basically, like an RWA is the representation of the physical or tangible asset of the real world into the blockchain for the purpose of kind of exposing it to the wider mass and to gain like liquidity outside of the traditional markets. And if we look at the more friendly SEC of how they actually break down the categories of RWAs, more particularly in securities, we have 4 ones. Basically, you have issuer sponsor, where the token itself is 100% a security. It's actually registered on the issuer's book. So this has the same level of compliance that your normal brokerage account when you're trying to buy any stocks. So this is fully gated. You can't find it unless unless your address has been fully whitelisted, you've done the proper whitelist checks, and so on. Then you have tokenized security entitlements, which basically is you hold a claim against the company that's representing the asset. This would be similar, I guess, to what Maple Finance is doing. That is like, hey, we're doing something with your money, but what I'm actually giving you is not the actual security itself, but rather a claim of the portion of the pie that we're kind of doing. Then you have the linked securities, which is a separate instrument, basically, whose payoff reference the underlying security. This is very similar to like the security-based swap, but the big difference is that actually here, with linked securities, the goal of this category is to represent the actual asset, and in the long run, to actually give you the same set of rights that if you hold the actual asset of chain. So let's say like voting power, dividends, and so on. And lastly, security-based swap, which I guess this one was maybe the first one with synthetic exposure via swap. Here is tricky because ultimately it's just a synthetic derivative. You don't own anything. You just own a token that mirrors one-to-one the price of chain. All right, so now that we know the categories, we're maybe going to look at where do these RWAs trades are happening on chain, right? Are they happening on AMMs, on like aggregator routers, or in intent-based systems? So if we look at the 4 categories, right, and we look at the issuer sponsor, for example, we have Securitize, who has gone for a full RFQ model because, as I said, this is fully gated and you need full-on KYC and registration in the issuer's books. So AMMs do not work because anyone can trade against the AMM, and if you gate the AMM, then it's more of a hassle to kind of have to do that than rather just simply provide like an RFQ system to your private market makers, which is something relatively common in finance. Tokenized security entitlement is the same, right? We have DTCC, which basically, again, is a claim against the assets that they have, and this is completely done via their private market makers. Then in linked securities, we have the example of Ondo Global Markets, Ondo Finance, and Xtalks, that it was renamed from Back Finance. And here, even though these assets are fully on-chain, there's still the liquidity lives off-chain, and basically they are a mint and redeem scheme. And then you have synthetic swaps, which can be traded on AMMs, but the problem is that then someone has to deploy the liquidity there and have them seed. So again, this is also mainly based on RFQ models. So I guess if we kind of break down into like simple terms, right, the reason why these assets are not on AMMs is simply because there's no liquidity for them. Someone has to deploy the liquidity, and that means that someone has to put the USDC, the EURC, or whatever other stablecoin against this other type of asset, this RWA. And that means that not only do you have to have inventory risk, but you also have the risk of having to put your controls entirely on smart contracts instead of kind of like the other normal off-chain checks that you might do. Whether on the other hand, intent-based systems allow basically the RFQ issuer to simply have, I guess, infinite liquidity because I don't have to hold the asset itself. I can just basically respond based on the demand that I have. If someone requests a quote for me, I can then say yes. I can mirror the swap off-chain and actually allow you to mint this asset on-chain or redeem it on the other hand, and then the transaction can happen. There's no need to have the liquidity or have my own inventory itself. I can actually like mirror one-to-one what's happening on-chain versus off-chain. And why is this, right? Like, why do intent-based systems fit so natively for the RWA infrastructure? So if we look at the example of Ondo Global Markets, and we see, right, that there's basically the off-chain side and the on-chain side, the actual flow is someone goes to the UI and says, I want to buy, I don't know, Tesla stock or whatever other asset that they might offer, and I want to get a quote. So basically, in intent-based system, the solver goes and says, well, I've actually gone to the RFQ endpoint. I told them someone wants to give me 5K, and what do you give me in exchange? And then this quote is shown to the user. Then the user actually signs the transaction and says, OK, I'm cool receiving this exchange of, I don't know, 1 to 5 for the USDC to the RWA. And then once that happens, basically, and the execution goes on chain, right? The settlement contract is the one that atomically then says, well, here's the USDC. The USDC goes to the on the global market contract, and then the on the global market has given permissions to the solver to actually create these tokens, to mint the tokens, and transfer them to the user. Create or burn in the case of selling. And then this all happens atomically. This is all the on-chain part, but what's interesting in here is the whole idea of infinite liquidity for the issuer, because basically what happens is that it allows the issuer to kind of mirror the entire bookkeeping of chain with on-chain, because it can react directly from the user kind of getting a quote saying, OK, well, let me go to my actual off-chain broker and say how much Tesla stock is currently, like what's the price, and how much currently I can give in terms of USDC, and then give you an answer. Once the user actually has executed the trade, I can say, OK, cool. Now I'm actually going to buy the actual asset off-chain through my brokerage, so that every mint and burn is actually backed one-to-one, right? Everything happens, so you cannot mint and burn if there is not the off-chain bookkeeping made by the primary market purchaser on the global market. So this is extremely beneficial because it's way faster, and because it also allows to not have inventory, which is, I guess, the biggest kind of stopper for people offering this type of assets. And just as a quick refresher, right, to go this example and why it actually even fits better, and I think Maria shared this before in 2 talks previously to this one, is that on CoW protocol, you have different UIs that create the signed intents, and then these intents get registered on the order book. And then you have a huge auction that can basically be broken down into different type of auctions. So this is very important for RWAs, because instead of funneling everything into one auction and having everyone compete at the same auction, you can actually have specialized solvers that only work for RWAs, or that are only interested for RWAs. And that means that, for example, if the issuer has certain rules that they want to make the solvers comply with, this can happen, because then only that solver is the one that has the allowed list, in a sense, to go to their market and actually get the quotes to then serve the orders that are within the action. And this is important for CoW protocol, because then you don't throttle the execution, right? We can have the top trade be like a normal crypto trade, USDC to WETH or whatever. The middle one be completely like a RWAs to RWAs, and the other one be USDC to Pepe coins. So this is why it's actually very nice that intent-based architectures allow the issuer to put the liquidity on chain. So what is the fundamental advantage of CoW protocol's intents? It's actually that also something that Maria said, right? That you sign what you want, and then solvers figure out how to get the liquidity. In this case, it's basically sell X and get more than Y. And the beautiful thing here on like the AMMs or like router base is that you can actually then do a lot of hops that before you couldn't do, because solvers not only aggregate like off-chain liquidity, but they also aggregate on-chain liquidity. So the idea being here that if you want to sell Pepe to, I don't know, to like a S&P 500 equity style, you can actually have the solver do, OK, Pepe to USDC or ETH to USDC, and then actually with the USDC or with the ETH, go to the RFQ, the issuer RFQ endpoint, and then say, well, now I have ETH or USDC, give me the price for this amount of ETH in exchange. And actually, it's also interesting because, as I said before, you have a competition of solvers that, even though they're both going against the same kind of liquidity source, they all compete in also, how much gas is it going to cost, how much surplus are you going to get, how are you doing the pricing strategies, and so on. So the solver that gives the most amount to the user is the one that wins. And lastly, the one fundamental advantage that is unique to CoW protocol, and it's actually why it's named after, is the possibility of doing peer-to-peer trades, which right now opens the whole idea of trading during the weekend. If you can coordinate and you place long-lasting limit orders, for example, you can trade in the weekend, even though these issuers kind of have the market closed in the weekend. Because when you trade peer-to-peer, you don't need outside liquidity, right? When someone wants to sell Tesla and someone wants to buy Tesla, you can overlap them directly. All right, so almost done. So what do intents unlock for RWAs? Well, if we think right at the whole idea of DeFi and the idea of the world computer is that, like stablecoins, tokenized assets are available across the entire world. It's not just any restriction. At the protocol level, anyone can have access to this type of tokens. And then it's a matter more of how the UI allows the user or what checks does the UI put in place to offer this type of products. But protocol-wise, right, anyone has access and it's fully operational 24/7. Then it's also interesting because you also, even though these type of solutions are made for institutions, also the protocol offers like institutional grade features, right? Like you can do TWAP, which is time weighted average price. You can do also stop loss or take profit or channel trading, which are more kind of what the institutions are used to having for playing around with this type of assets. You can also play limit orders. You can do this now nice cool thing that's called the cow wrappers / atomic bundles, which you can basically chain any interaction to an intent-based system, which is something that people tend to think that intents are not atomic, but they actually are now with the introduction of these smart contracts. But most importantly, it also allows to give a friendly UX, the Web2 style. You don't need to worry about gas. You don't need to worry about slippage. You don't need to worry about all these complicated things that are, I guess, relatively OK for crypto-native people, but for normies, they're not that easy to digest. And lastly, it allows the whole idea of the DeFi Lego stack. I finished this slide, which basically you have different options that you can build with the products. Like you can do all these chains of interactions together in one single transaction. Yeah, sorry, and one more thing. We are actually hiring, so if you are a DevRel, integrations engineer, visual designer, or a backend engineer, please reach out. And thank you for listening.